Hi, I'm Jessica, one of the tour guides for Free Tours by Foot London, and I specialize in museums. Today, I'm going to be walking you through the Victoria and Albert Museum, which has been referred to as an extremely capacious handbag. On our tour today, we're going to see some pretty magical stuff. The Victoria and Albert, also known as the V&A, is packed with spectacular objects. We'll start with Dale Chihuly's glasswork and the breathtaking Ardabil carpet, and then admire the macabre and delightful Tipu's tiger. Next, we'll marvel at Raphael's cartoons, which are massive patterns for tapestries in St. Peter's Basilica. And then we'll visit the fashion collection and the European Sculpture Hall to admire Auguste Rodin's bronzes and Canova's Three Graces. We peek into the William Morris-designed garden cafe before looking at some Vajrayana Buddhist art from Nepal. Then, we journey through the epic and monumental cast courts for Trajan's Column and Michelangelo's David. Finally, we walk through the medieval Europe galleries to look at effigies and altarpieces before heading upstairs to admire Tudor artwork and the colossal Great Bed of Ware, before finishing off our tour with the Hereford screen. Remember to like and subscribe and comment below and let me know which of these objects is your favorite. In some ways, the Victoria and Albert Museum defies description. The Victoria and Albert is also huge, 140 galleries, and to explore this entire museum, we would need days, if not weeks. So today, I'm just going to wander around and show you some of the most important objects, the most famous objects, and things that just tickle my fancy as I walk by. It was Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, who was the mastermind and the driving force behind both the Great Exhibition, or First World's Fair, in 1851, and the Victoria and Albert Museum, which opened as the South Kensington Museum 1 year later. For people in Prince Albert's time, there was a belief that if you showed people beautiful objects and beautiful things, that they could have a better life and be a better person. Of course, that didn't take into account the people that they were colonizing and taking the objects from. That said, it was a really common belief at the time, with people like William Morris espousing that everyday objects should be beautiful and that everybody should have access to beauty. So it was believed that if you brought somebody to this museum, they would have a better life. So maybe I can help you have a better life if you watch the video ahead. When you first enter the Victoria and Albert, when you look up, you see this breathtaking sight, this massive and iconic glass sculpture created by Seattle artist Dale Chihuly. This piece, which was made in Venice, is part of his chandelier series that he was working on from 1992, but this one was completed in 2001. It's called the Rotunda Chandelier, and it's meant to evoke the greens and blues of the Venice Lagoon. Up on the mezzanine level, you can also see the Hereford screen, which we're going to come back to and talk about at the very end of our tour. So I'm just going to head to our first treasure, which is the Ardabil carpet. Now, a carpet, not the most exciting thing. Wrong. The skill and craftsmanship and number of man-hours that have gone in to create this carpet, dating to the early 16th century, is unbelievable. So follow me. It lights up every half hour and on the hour, and it's just a few minutes to 11 right now. This elaborate carpet was created between 1539 and 1540 in Iran, and it's thought to be the world's oldest dated carpet, not to mention one of the largest. Most experts believe that it was created by hundreds of skilled craftspeople to decorate the shrine of Sheikh Safi al-Din Ardabili, which then became a site of pilgrimage. And just check out the size of this massive rectangular case, which is only lit for 10 minutes every hour, which is to preserve the 10 colors in the carpet. This is really important, as these are natural dyes, made from materials such as pomegranate rind and indigo. It's only possible to date this carpet due to a specific inscription on one edge. It includes the date, 946 in the Muslim calendar, equivalent to AD 1539-1540. While many notable rugs around the world are woven from silk, this one is wool, which holds color better than silk. It's also incredibly dense, 5,300 knots per 10 centimeters square. It's unreal. That density allowed the designer to incorporate a lot of detail. Making such a large carpet with so many knots would have taken a team of skilled weavers several years, so up to 10 weavers would have worked on the carpet at any one time. Carpet weaving was usually performed by women in the home and in domestic contexts, but in a court commission like this one, it was probably woven by men. Believe it or not, there are many copies in famous places around the world. There's an Ardabil copy at 10 Downing Street, and even Hitler had a copy in his Berlin office. Ugh. So I'm just walking nice and slowly through this gallery now, as we make our way to one of the most famous items in the entire Victoria and Albert Museum. And of course, I'm talking about Tipu's tiger. This is something else. First of all, it's really, really big. So, I'm just going to hold my hand up here. You can see it is nearly life-size. You can see me standing in the mirror behind, and then to get the comparison of the size of this British soldier and this tiger. So this was looted from the palace of Tipu, who was a ruler in Mysore, a kingdom in India. Of course, before British colonization, India was many, many small kingdoms, including Mysore, which is famous for its dosas, and I've enjoyed them there. I've also been to Tipu's palace. Tipu was killed when the East India Company stormed Seringapatam in 1799. The soldiers looted this automaton, and then it's brought to England, much to the delight, but also should be to the horror, because this is not a kind interpretation. This is meant to be mocking and ridiculing and wishing death upon British soldiers. Some people may realize that Tipu actually held out for nearly 30 years with his army fighting off British incursions and created this. So you can see the handle in the center there. The crank would be turned. That's what makes this an automaton, because it moves. And the tiger is bending down to bite the neck of the British soldier. But there's one more bit I'm not telling you. It makes music, and the more you wind it, the faster and louder you can hear the screams of the British soldier and the growls and roars of the tiger. Morbid? Absolutely. Amusing? 100%. Deserved? Yes. So do not miss Tipu's tiger. You won't miss it. It's really one of the most famous objects here. Now, let's walk past these absolutely delightful heraldic beasts, the Dacre beasts. So these are a rare example of surviving Tudor woodwork. But we're heading down into a very important room here, and it's one that's kept dimly lit for a good reason. The custom-built room designed to house the Raphael cartoons. But if you're expecting me to show you The Simpsons or maybe a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon strip, I'm really sorry. That's not what's going to happen here. Because in this context, the word cartoon comes from the Latin cartone, which means large pieces of paper. And that's exactly what these are. Now, these were commissioned from the great master Raphael from Pope Leo X in 1513. Now, Pope Leo X was a member of the Medici family, if you're interested in that history, and he wanted to leave his mark there on St. Peter's Basilica. And so Leo X wanted to not only add something of equal grandeur, but also tell literal stories from the Bible. And so he commissioned Raphael to create these preparations for tapestries. And remember, this is just a few years after Martin Luther, and so he's trying to curry favor. He wants people to be drawn into coming to the Basilica and to have very good feelings about the artwork that they can find inside of there. So he commissions 10 massive tapestries depicting scenes in the Bible, and we have 7 of the drawings here on paper. Now, these were done back to front. That's why you can see Jesus is raising his left hand, and it should be his right hand. And that's because when sent to the embroiderers, which were in Belgium, by the way, in Brussels, And this was very strategic. That was a place that had very much been wooed by Martin Luther. So the Pope is trying to give them a lot of work and have them feel favorable about the Catholic Church. But this one here is an embroidered version. It's a copy. It's not one of the ones from the Sistine Chapel, obviously. And you can see that Jesus is correctly raising his right hand. Now let's just go back to the cartone, or the plan. It's incredibly detailed, and nothing like this had ever been done before. So these were reproduced all over Europe. Charles I decided to purchase the actual paper artwork, and they're finally treated like artworks by the 18th century, and they end up here in the South Kensington Gallery in the 19th century, which of course later becomes known as the Victoria and Albert. Okay, so I'm now just walking into the fashion collection, and we cannot visit the Victoria and Albert without talking about fashion. That's one of its major purview. So there is really beautiful and important fashion in this collection from the 17th century right up until now. All right, so I know a lot of people love the Regency period, and they love learning more about Bridgerton. Now, of course, Bridgerton is kind of fictionalized, very highly fictionalized version of historical time period, but I can show you some of the beautiful fashions. And just coming around the corner, of course, I thought to myself, Bridgerton. The dresses are very high-waisted, and these remain popular from the late 18th century right up until the early 19th century. You had delicate fans that people were carrying, and yes, there is a fan museum in London. So this is just some of the really interesting fashion here. But let's look at radical fashion from the 90s. This kind of reminds me of the George Michael supermodel period. Flamboyant look, Jean-Paul Gaultier, similar to Madonna's cone bra, etc. So we're not just talking about ancient history. And even here, look, London Contemporary Menswear, 2012 to 2015. So just like many other museums, the Victoria and Albert is still collecting modern items. And we're just approaching the European Sculpture Gallery. One of the sculpture galleries, I should say. There are many. And this one in particular is focused on Auguste Rodin. Auguste Rodin, considered one of the most important French sculptors, one of the most important sculptors of the 19th century, taking inspiration from Greek and Roman models, but bringing them into the 19th and 20th century with deep emotion, with a lot of psychological exploration, twisted, tortured figures. Rodin left a collection of 17 or 18, I can't quite remember which, 17 or 18 of these bronze sculptures to the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1914. This is just before his death in 1917, and it continues to form a huge part of the museum's kind of heart and soul. So he chose these pieces to represent his work for an exhibition of French art in 1914. However, World War I broke out soon after, and Rodin was worried that these pieces might not be safe if shipped back to the continent, and so he decided to bequeath them as a special gift here. So really is remarkable. And if you're a fan of Rodin, then you cannot afford to miss the Victoria and Albert. This one here actually by a female sculptor called Winifred Turner. Beautiful, very Art Deco style. You can see this is 1934. We have lots of things from the 19th and 20th century, so we actually have some more sculpture and art pieces by women, because women were starting to become slightly more allowed to participate in the arts at this time. So this is Venetian Boy Catching a Crab by Henrietta Scarrett Montalba. This was exhibited in 1893 and was actually at the World's Exhibition in Chicago, receiving a lot of critical acclaim at the time. So a very, very different style than Rodin. Very smooth body. It doesn't, the boy has a very smooth body. He doesn't have the kind of gnarled and twisted form that Rodin sculptures do. A different kind of truth. But I just have to say I really, really love this crab. That's right here. I have a crab tattoo on my foot. Maybe you can see. So I like crabs. Okay, so now we are visiting Antonio Canova, We're still in European sculpture. One of his most famous pieces is actually Psyche revived by Cupid's kiss, which is in the Louvre. But I'm going to show you his second most famous sculpture, and definitely his most famous here in the Victoria and Albert. And we're approaching from the backside. Some might be appreciative of that. I won't judge. And this is The Three Graces by Antonio Canova. Often used to symbolize the Victoria and Albert. That's how famous this statue sculpture is. So in Greek mythology, the three graces represent mirth, which is joy, elegance, and youth. So this was actually commissioned by the Duke of Bedford from Antonio Canova, who was a very important Italian sculptor at the time in the late 18th century. Canova was born in the Venetian Republic city of Pisano, and throughout his lifetime he would become one of the most important and famous sculptors, not just in Italy but around Europe at the time. Very classical style. You can see again what Rodin was reacting to. Okay, we're going to continue through the sculpture gallery. Again, like with any of my museum tours, please do not gasp as I walk past one of your favorite objects. I hate to say it, but there's so many amazing things in this museum that it is impossible for me to stop and talk about every single one. So if you see something beautiful, if you see something you want me to talk about more in the future, just leave a comment below. And you haven't even seen the half of it. Just wait till we get to the cast courts. I did want to stop really quickly here and show you something, the Lamentation over the Dead Christ. And this comes from an Italian workshop in the 15th century. So the 16th century, so sometime around 1510. What you can see here is a sculpture that we would be quite used to seeing, made from terracotta. However, it's glazed with ceramics on top, and this was really unusual at the time, and you can see it was so difficult that actually only two of the figures and Christ's loincloth there have had the technique done. So this is quite unusual. And another thing that we can see here that's really unusual, unlike most statues and sculptures at the time, is we can see the back. We can see that the back has no detail because, and it's quite haunting looking actually, there's a real folk horror vibe to the back of this. And this is because we can see how it would have been adhered to an altar. So it's lovely to be able to see the whole piece in context. So the reason why the two figures on the left have this glaze, which is called a biscuit glaze, and the figure on the left doesn't, is that Mary Magdalene likely, and she's the figure on the right rather, Mary Magdalene likely shattered. And so rather than risk refiring the whole sculpture, they painted her. So the paint has worn off because this is 500 years old. And did I mention that the Victoria and Albert Museum is humongous? It is absolutely massive. And it is, I find, a little bit confusing to navigate your way around. I mean, it's not the Louvre, let's be honest there. But if you are coming, I do recommend going on their free taster tours, which happen every day at 10:30 and 2. We double check the schedule. Again, you've seen the back of another statue here. That would have been on an altar. Yeah, I definitely recommend checking out those tours. They are free. Or, of course, you can book a private tour with me. I'll show you around the entire museum with joy. Okay, so this is a modern hall, been redone. Not too exciting, but just you wait. Just you wait till I show you the absolutely beautiful garden cafe, designed by none other than William Morris, father of arts and crafts, art movement. I'm not going to go inside. I don't want to bother people who are having their tea. There is always a really long queue to get inside this absolutely stunning cafe. Look at that. This is the place to have a tea or coffee. And we have such a hallmark of William Morris's work right here, which is to put these kind of pithy sayings up at the top. And here another part of this stunning, stunning garden cafe. I believe every Friday, I think it's Friday, check the website, you can actually book to have the same afternoon tea that Queen Victoria liked to have. And you can have it in this stunning, stunning room. What a beautiful experience. Here's something else I really love, and actually I need to learn more about it myself, but we have this unbelievable tiled, fired staircase. This is really common at the National Gallery as well, these Victorian museums, to place the names of great artists in the past. So people, Phidias, Raphael, Titian, Rembrandt, Turner. If you're interested in seeing more works by these artists, watch my video about the National Gallery or the Musée d'Orsay. But just look at the details on this staircase. Look at these. I mean, I can just show you the size. Really large. This is part of that belief that beautiful things will make you a beautiful person. That was the idea at the time. Of course, not always so beautiful how things were acquired, and definitely not everybody could afford to take time off and come to the museum. But if they could, it was free to enter. Now we're here in some galleries of Buddhist art. I used to live in Kathmandu in Nepal. This type of Buddhism in Nepal, parts of northern India, Tibet, and parts of China is called Vajrayana Buddhism. It's a type of Mahayana Buddhism. I'm going to show you one of my favorite sculptures here, statues. So here we have the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, and this one is the Padmapani version of Avalokiteshvara, which means lotus bearer. So can you see there in his hand, the monks would place a fresh lotus, which is the symbol of Buddhism, and then here his hand is opening in a symbol of compassion. Now it's pouring rain, so I am not going to stay out here for too long. What would it be if it wasn't in August without pouring rain? I was actually here yesterday as well, and this central little reflecting pool was filled with joyous children because it was 29 degrees Celsius, so it was very, very hot. So we're in the central court. Actually, it's nice and cool out here. So the central courtyard and a cafe, so you can enjoy some food there. So the central courtyard. It's heading towards midday and the museum is getting busier and busier. I really recommend coming to the museum usually actually later in the day or right when it first opens. But remember, when it first opens, you're going to have a lot of tour groups here. And then later in the day tends to get a bit quieter, but of course you run the risk of exhibits closing for the day, closing early due to staff shortages and other reasons. Now we're heading through more Buddhist objects. Most of these Buddhist sculptures and objects of veneration from Southeast Asia. So this is mostly Theravadan Buddhism, but also from parts of India and Pakistan as well. I think this is going to be from Burma. Sacred Buddha, Myanmar, yeah. This one just caught my eye. I've spent some time in Burma, of course also called Myanmar. And the face. So if you look at sculptures, different parts of the world, of course, they usually look like the people who live in those areas. And Burmese Buddhas often have really big ears as well, which is how I noticed. Here is a sculpture of the emaciated Buddha. This is a common sculpture to see in Thailand especially, and this is because Buddha this is during his first attempt to reach enlightenment. So he has extreme fasting for 6 years. And this is why his body is so emaciated. I want to show you this unbelievable view of the cast courts. And let's come over onto this side. So the cast courts were built to display the museum's collection of copies. And remember, this is all part of the Victorian idea of knowledge and beauty. This is very much exemplified by Prince Albert's beliefs at the time. There's the huge David. Just look at the size of the people compared to some of these objects. So the cast courts are a really important place for Victorians to be able to come and learn about monumental structures and sculptures from around the world. Trust me, if the British could have gotten them here, they would have. But sometimes making a copy was the next best thing. And I talk about this a little bit in my British Museum video about the Enlightenment Gallery, that having the originals wasn't always important to Georgian and Victorian collectors. So now that we know a little bit about the rationale behind plaster casting, we can talk about Trajan's column, which is one of the stars here in the cast courts. This has been towering over visitors since the cast courts opened in 1873, and it's no mere copy. Like Poppy's cast of David that we're going to talk about next, this casting technique required its own set of skills and artistic mastery. Of course, the original Trajan's column is the centerpiece of the Roman Forum, which was built to laud Emperor Trajan's successful campaigns against the Dacians in 101 and 105 Common Era. It was likely built by architect Apollodorus of Damascus and features highlights of both successful campaigns. The column includes 155 different scenes and more than 2,500 figures and animals. Emperor Napoleon III requested molds from the Roman original, and so legendary Parisian founder Leopold Audry suspended the molds in a solution of copper sulfate, and then used electrical charges to create copies of the patterns. We're going to see that a bit later on with the Hereford screen. These electrotypes were then used as patterns to create these plaster casts. Therefore, this column is a copy of a copy. The museum acquired the column in the 1860s, and of course there was no space large enough to accommodate it. That's why the cast courts were built to be 25 meters high. This was specifically done so that this column could be displayed in two parts. The plaster reliefs were mounted onto two brick cores. Here, you can see the column being assembled like a giant puzzle around the brick core. Interestingly, this photo was taken by Isabel Agnes Cooper, the first official photographer at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and perhaps the first female museum photographer in the world. Now we're going to go down onto the floor, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the plaster cast of Michelangelo's David. Look at the size of the people. From here he looks a bit tiny, but look at the size of the people next to him. He's absolutely massive. So let's go down and look at some of these objects. And now we're entering the ground floor of the cast courts. We've only seen it from above and to this point. You can see all kinds of things that were cast, replicas, and there's even some displays about modern 3D printing, which is really cool. Now, when I was upstairs, maybe you didn't realize just how big these are, but I'm going to turn this around so you can see. I barely reached the beginning of the relief. It's big. Some more very interesting casts. These are effigies, some of them from Temple Church and other churches around the country. I recently rewatched the Da Vinci Code. It was on TV one night, and you can see some of these are this one here, one of the Knights Templar from Temple Church. This one from the chapter house in Le Mans, France. Little lion and a dog. So not just antiquity, the Victorians are also casting things from this country and from France as well, putting them all in one place. So again, this idea of a huge repository of knowledge that could make you a better person. And we're not just saying that uncritically. Of course, there's a lot of ways we could unpack this and talk about who gets to be a better person and how and why. But I'm just telling you the rationale at the time. Now let's go look at this massive sculpture of Michelangelo's David. So this is probably the most famous sculpture in the cast court. And this sculpture has been reproduced countless times around the world. So this was a gift to Queen Victoria from the Grand Duke Leopold II of Tuscany. And this was kind of a peace offering since he refused to export a painting which the National Gallery wanted to buy at the time. Now, Michelangelo, of course, carved David from a single block of marble, and this was not. So the Grand Duke of Tuscany originally commissioned this to be a bronze, but it was his cast maker, Clement Papi, who decided to make it in plaster instead. And the mold that he created was more than 1,500 pieces. Immensely talented. Now apparently Queen Victoria was so scandalized when she first saw this that the Victoria and Albert Museum had a plaster leaf created to cover David's genitals. And that's not just urban legend. The Victorian era, named after Queen Victoria herself, of course, was legendarily conservative, especially about all manners of sex. So this is really one of the most impressive and famous parts of the entire museum. Okay, we're going to leave the cast courts. Oh, look. My favorite. Anyone who's watched my Louvre video knows that I love Michelangelo's rebellious slave and dying slave. And here we go. I actually didn't even realize these were here. You learn something new every day. So beautiful plaster casts of the original, which are in Paris. We're going to head through the medieval and Renaissance now. Medieval art, of course, extremely religious in nature. In fact, in many contexts, it was not possible to create art that was not religious for fear of an artist being named a blasphemer or, in a lot of contexts, being executed. So throughout these galleries, you have a lot of stone sculpture that would have been in churches, but also just unbelievable altar pieces like this one here called the Brixen altarpiece. No one is actually 100% sure where this comes from, but it's likely from Clausen, dating to the early 16th century, around 1510. Now we're just approaching a number of medieval effigies. Unlike the cast effigies we saw in the cast courts, these are actual stone effigies removed from churches. This one here, the effigy of Don Garcia de Osorio, a knight of the Order of Santiago, and this is from a church in Toledo. Okay, now we're going to head to a few objects that are upstairs as we head into the home stretch of our tour. One of the main differences between the British Museum and the Victoria and Albert, of course, is its emphasis on art and design. Just look how beautiful even the hallways are here. Everything has been designed with such purpose. But it's not just that. It's also that there's a concerted effort to spend more time talking about Britain. So here, we've gone quite far back to the Tudor time, and we have a portrait of Henry VIII, painted sometime between 1535 and 1540. And just behind me here is a display case featuring Henry VIII's father. Here we are, Henry VII, the first Tudor king. And this bust created sometime between 1509 and 1511. And we have his son, portrait of Edward VI as the Prince of Wales. So this was not painted during his lifetime, but you can see he's holding a Tudor rose. But I brought you here to see one thing in particular upstairs, and this is the Great Bed of Ware. You might be thinking again, just like when we saw the carpet downstairs, well, what's the big deal? It's just a bed. Yeah, but look at the size of the bed. And you've got to remember at this time in history, the bed was not actually always in a bedroom. It was often in the living room, in the lounge room, in the room where you would greet people. So this enormous bed dates back to at least to 1596. So it was recorded by a traveller at an inn in Herefordshire, which is 22 miles north of London. And this was actually, a lot of times, and I myself was confused. I always thought that the Great Bed of Ware must have been belonging to a king or a queen. I mean, just look at it. But it's not true. It was from an inn And they used it to attract clientele, to say, listen, if you come and stay at our inn, you can sleep in this absolutely massive bed. And just look at the sheer amount of dressings and down stuffed kind of pillows. No such thing as a modern mattress at the time. And you can actually touch some of these things. These are the original materials. Not original, rather, they would have been long gone, but these are replicas of the original materials. The V&A, like many other museums, is doing more and more tactile things for people with different needs and also for children as well. So the Great Bed of Ware is definitely worth seeing. And let's just a little bit more royal history here. Here's a replica of the famous painting, the famous kind of triptych painting. It's not a true triptych, but depicting the three sides of Charles I. Of course, the only side that's truly important, his head, which would be cut off at the end of the English Civil War in 1649. And actually there's a really large bust of his son just ahead. Let's have a quick look at that. We've got Charles II, this magnificent bust, signed and dated 1684. So I promised that I was going to come back and talk about the Hereford screen, and this is actually going to be the final object on our tour. So I'm staring at it now. It's absolutely lovely. Let me just flip the camera around here, and you can also see it. It's got a place of pride in the Victoria and Albert. So there is the Dale Chihuly that we talked about a little bit earlier on. And here is the Hereford screen. So let's have a look at it closer. Now this is a giant choir screen made of iron, designed by Sir George Gilbert Scott. If you've heard that name before, it's because he's a very famous architect and designer, with his most famous works, the Albert Memorial and the Midland Grand Hotel, which we call the St. Pancras Hotel today. By the way, his grandson, Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, designed the iconic red phone box. So this screen is all about evoking the grandeur of a Gothic cathedral, but using the modern tools and materials that were then available in the middle of the 19th century. It was first showcased at the 1862 International Exhibition, where it was called, quote, the grandest and most triumphant achievement of modern architectural art. It weighs more than 8 tons, and it's a mix of wrought and cast iron, brass, copper, semi-precious stones, and mosaics, with decorative elements like Jesus and the angels completed not by hand, but by a process called electroforming. Believe it or not, by 1967, the screen was fully dismantled because it was considered out of style and out of fashion. It was then taken to Coventry Museum in boxes and was just never unpacked. In 1984, the museum passed on ownership to the Victoria and Albert, where conservators discovered that it was in terrible condition. They then embarked on the museum's largest restoration and conservation project to date, and in 2001 it was assembled here, given pride of place above the main entrance. It's the perfect object to end our tour on. It's a mix of old and new, design and religion, art and technology, all of which the Victoria and Albert Museum has in spades. Well, that's the end of our tour here at the Victoria and Albert Museum. I hope that you've enjoyed learning about this museum as much as I've enjoyed showing you around, showing you my favorite objects, and of course the objects that I think you shouldn't miss when you're here. If you like this video, remember to like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments sections what other museums you'd like to see me cover. Remember, in addition to guiding for free tours by foot, I also have a channel called The Museum Guide. So if you like in-depth tours of museums, give me a follow there. Thank you, and see you next time.